The crystal tumbler exploded against the kitchen wall, sending shards flying toward Brooke's 8-month pregnant belly. She gasped and instinctively turned sideways, her hands flying to protect her unborn child as glass fragments scattered across the marble floor. The sharp crack echoed through their pristine penthouse kitchen, followed by an awful silence that made her heart pound. "Look what you made me do," Clayton Marshall said, his voice cold and controlled, despite the rage burning in his dark eyes. He stood 6 feet away, his expensive suit still perfectly pressed, even after his violent outburst. Brooke Hamilton pressed her back against the granite countertop, her breath coming in short gasps. At 32, she had once been confident and successful, running her own marketing firm before Clayton convinced her to give it up when they married 5 years ago. Now she felt small and vulnerable, her swollen belly making escape impossible. "I didn't make you do anything," she whispered, then immediately regretted speaking. Clayton's jaw tightened, and she recognized the warning signs. His left eye twitched when his anger reached dangerous levels. "Don't contradict me, Brooke." He stepped closer, his Italian leather shoes crunching on broken glass. "I told you I had a bad day. The Meridian deal fell through because of incompetent lawyers, and I come home to my pregnant wife nagging me about counseling." She hadn't been nagging. She'd simply suggested he might want to talk to someone about the stress he'd been under lately. His temper had grown worse over the past month, especially as her due date approached. But Clayton saw any suggestion as criticism, any concern as an attack on his authority. "I was just worried about you," Brooke said softly, her hand still protectively covering her belly. The baby was kicking now, probably startled by the loud crash. "You've been working such long hours, and the doctor said stress isn't good for—" "The doctor said stress isn't good for you," Clayton interrupted, his voice rising again. "Everything has to be about you and that baby, doesn't it? Do you have any idea what I'm dealing with at Marshall Industries? The board is breathing down my neck, our stock price is dropping, and instead of supporting me, you want me to waste time talking to some shrink about my feelings?" Brooke felt tears prick her eyes but fought them back. Crying would only make him angrier. She'd learned that lesson months ago when her hormones first started affecting her emotions. Clayton had no patience for what he called pregnancy drama. "I'm sorry," she said, hating herself for apologizing when she'd done nothing wrong. "I know you're under pressure. I just want to help." "You want to help?" Clayton laughed bitterly. "Then stop questioning everything I do. Stop making me feel like a failure in my own home. Do you know what my colleagues think when they see you waddling around at company events? They think I can't control my own wife." The words hit her like physical blows. Control. That's what this had always been about, even when she was too in love to see it clearly. Clayton needed to control everything: her career, her friendships, her family relationships, and now even her pregnancy. "I've gained exactly the weight the doctor recommended," Brooke said quietly, a spark of her old self flickering to life. "And I'm not waddling. I'm 8 months pregnant with your child." Clayton's face darkened. "My child, exactly. Which means you need to start thinking about what's best for this family instead of undermining me at every turn." He moved closer, and Brooke could smell the whiskey on his breath. He'd been drinking more lately, though he was careful never to appear intoxicated in public. His image as a successful CEO was everything to him. "I've never undermined you," she protested, then flinched as he slammed his palm against the counter next to her head. "You suggested counseling in front of Maria," he hissed, referring to their housekeeper, who came twice a week. "You made me look weak in front of the help. Do you understand how humiliating that is?" Brooke's heart raced. Maria had been putting away groceries when she'd mentioned the counseling idea. But the older woman barely spoke English and certainly hadn't seemed to be listening. Clayton's paranoia about his image had reached new heights lately. "She wasn't even paying attention," Brooke said, trying to keep her voice calm. "And even if she was, wanting to take care of your mental health isn't weak. It's smart." "Don't tell me what's smart," Clayton snapped. "I built a $50 million company from nothing. I think I know a little more about what's smart than a woman who gave up her little marketing business to play house." The cruelty in his voice made her gasp. He'd convinced her to close her business by promising they would start a family right away, and that he wanted her to focus on being a mother? It had taken 3 years to get pregnant, 3 years during which she'd slowly lost touch with her professional contacts and her sense of independence. That little marketing business was successful, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I had 12 employees and annual revenue of over $2 million. Clayton's expression turned dangerous. Had being the operative word, now you have nothing except what I give you. And if you don't start showing some gratitude and respect, you might find yourself with even less. The threat hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Brooke felt the baby kick hard against her ribs, as if responding to her elevated stress levels. She needed to calm down, needed to diffuse this situation before it escalated further. Clayton, please, she said, placing both hands on her belly. The baby can sense when I'm upset. Can we just... The baby, the baby, the baby, he exploded, his face flushing red. I'm so sick of hearing about that baby. My entire life has been turned upside down because of your pregnancy. I can't travel when I need to. I can't entertain clients at home anymore. And I have to listen to you complain about every little ache and pain. I don't complain, Brooke said, her own anger finally breaking through her fear. I've barely said anything about being uncomfortable. Even though my back hurts constantly and I can't sleep, I've gone to every company event you've asked me to attend. Even when I was so nauseous I could barely stand. I've supported you through everything. Supported me. Clayton's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. You've been a burden, an embarrassment. Do you know what Richard Morrison said to me at the club last week? He said I looked tired and asked if the pregnancy was taking a toll. Everyone can see that you're dragging me down. Brooke stared at him in shock. This wasn't just about the counseling suggestion or even the stress from work. This was about something much deeper, something that had been growing inside him for months. Are you saying you regret getting me pregnant? She asked, her voice barely audible. Clayton's silence was answer enough. The hurt that crashed over her was so intense it was almost physical. She'd wanted this baby so desperately, had endured fertility treatments and disappointments for years, and he regretted it. I see, she said, straightening her shoulders despite the weight of her pregnancy. So what do you want me to do? Clayton, I can't exactly unpregnant myself. You could start by remembering who's in charge here, he said through gritted teeth. You could stop questioning my decisions and making me look bad. You could act like a grateful wife instead of a victim. I'm not acting like a victim, Brooke said, her voice stronger now. I'm trying to have a conversation with my husband about something that concerns me. If you think that makes me ungrateful, then maybe we have bigger problems than I thought. The words hung between them for a moment, and Brooke saw something shift in Clayton's expression. The mask of controlled anger slipped, revealing something uglier underneath. Bigger problems, he repeated softly. You want to talk about bigger problems? Brooke, here's a bigger problem for you. Before she could react, he grabbed the crystal decanter from the counter and hurled it at the wall above her head. The heavy glass shattered with tremendous force, sending sharp fragments raining down on her. Brooke screamed and dropped to her knees, covering her head with her arms as glass cut into her face and arms. A large shard sliced across her left cheek, and she felt warm blood trickling down her neck. Clayton, she gasped, looking up at him in horror. The baby, for a moment, he stared down at her with an expression she'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and completely without remorse. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, his face crumpled with what looked like genuine shock. Oh, God, he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. Brooke, I'm sorry. I didn't mean, are you hurt? Is the baby okay? But Brooke was already crawling away from him, glass crunching under her knees as she tried to reach her phone on the far counter. Blood dripped from the cut on her face, and she could feel smaller wounds on her arms where the glass had found its mark. Don't touch me, she said when Clayton reached for her. Don't you dare touch me. Brooke, please, he said, his voice now full of the charm that had once won her heart. I lost my temper. You know how much pressure I'm under. I would never hurt you or the baby on purpose. She managed to grab her phone with shaking hands, her back pressed against the kitchen island. Clayton knelt a few feet away, his expensive suit now wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked like the successful businessman he was, not like someone who had just committed an act of violence against his pregnant wife. I need to call someone, Brooke said, blood from her cheek dripping onto her phone screen. Call Dr. Chambers, Clayton said quickly. We'll go to the hospital and make sure everything is okay. I'll tell them you fell. We don't need to. No? Brooke's voice was surprisingly strong. I'm calling my brother. Clayton's face went pale. Brooke, think about what you're doing. Vernon is a trauma surgeon. He'll overreact to a few small cuts. This is between us. We can handle this privately. But Brooke was already dialing. Vernon Hamilton had always been protective of her, ever since they were children and their father died in a car accident. He'd warned her about Clayton's controlling tendencies when they first started dating, though she'd been too in love to listen. Now, as she listened to the phone ring, she realized that her 8-month pregnant belly had probably saved her life. If she hadn't turned to protect the baby, the crystal decanter would have hit her directly in the face. Vernon, she said when he answered, her voice barely a whisper. He hurt me. Vernon. The baby. Doctor. Vernon Hamilton was reviewing surgery notes in the trauma bay when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. He was covering the emergency department tonight and couldn't afford distractions. But when he saw Brooke's name on the screen, some instinct made him pick up. Vernon. Her voice was so quiet he could barely hear her. He hurt me. Vernon. The baby. The medical chart dropped from his hands. Brooke, what happened? Where are you? Home, she whispered, and he could hear the pain in her voice. Glass everywhere. I'm bleeding. Vernon was already grabbing his keys, heading for the exit. At 38, he'd seen enough trauma to know when someone was in real danger. His sister's voice carried the shock and fear of a victim, not someone who'd had a simple accident. Are you having contractions? He asked, switching to doctor mode while his heart raced with sibling panic. Any abdominal pain? Dizziness? I don't think so, Brooke said. But there's blood on my face, and I can feel cuts on my arms. Clayton threw something, and it shattered. Clayton threw something. Vernon's jaw tightened as he jogged toward his car in the hospital parking garage. He'd never liked his brother-in-law, had always sensed something predatory beneath the charm and success. But Brooke had been so happy when they married, so proud to be the wife of an important businessman. I'm coming right now, he said, starting his car with one hand while keeping the phone pressed to his ear. It's going to take me 15 minutes to get there. I need you to listen carefully. Okay? Okay, Brooke whispered. First, check if you're bleeding anywhere on your belly or having any pain in your abdomen. Even small amounts of blood could indicate placental problems at 8 months pregnant. He heard her moving around, probably checking herself. No blood on my stomach, she reported. The cuts are on my face and arms. Good. Now, are you having any contractions? Even mild cramping could be a sign that the shock triggered early labor. I don't think so, she said. The baby's moving a lot, kicking more than usual. That's actually good news. Active fetal movement is a positive sign. Vernon maneuvered through downtown traffic, using his medical credentials to justify running a red light. Where is Clayton now? There was a pause. Right here. He's trying to apologize? Put me on speaker, Vernon said firmly. I want to hear exactly what happened. Vernon, I don't think... Brooke, put me on speaker now. He heard the phone beep, then Clayton's voice, smooth and controlled despite the circumstances. Vernon, hello. There's been a small accident. Nothing serious, but Brooke is a bit shaken up. A small accident? Vernon's voice could have cut glass. You threw something at my 8-month pregnant sister hard enough to shatter and cut her face? That's not an accident. Clayton, that's assault. You don't understand the situation, Clayton said, his tone growing defensive. Brooke startled me while I was holding a glass. It slipped from my hands and broke against the wall. She was unfortunately standing too close. Even through the phone, Vernon could hear the lies. He'd listened to enough abusers explain away their violence to recognize the pattern, minimize the action, blame the victim, make it sound accidental. Brooke, he said, tell me exactly what happened, in your own words. Vernon, maybe we should discuss this later, Clayton interrupted. Brooke needs medical attention, not an interrogation. I'm the doctor here, Vernon snapped. And right now I need to assess whether my sister and her baby are in immediate danger. Brooke, talk to me. Brooke's voice was shaky but clear. We were arguing about counseling. I suggested he might want to talk to someone about his stress levels. He got angry and threw his whiskey glass at the wall, Then grabbed the crystal decanter and threw that too. I turned to protect my belly and glass cut my face and arms. Vernon felt cold rage washing over him. This wasn't an accident or a moment of clumsiness. This was deliberate violence against a pregnant woman. "Has this happened before?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Vernon, this is hardly the time for family therapy," Clayton said before Brooke could respond. "We should be focusing on getting her medical care. I'll decide what she needs," Vernon said. "Brooke, has he hurt you before?" The silence stretched so long that Vernon thought the call had dropped. Then Brooke spoke, her voice barely audible. "Not like this," she whispered. "Never with glass or anything that would leave marks." Vernon's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Not like this implied there had been other incidents. Other forms of violence that hadn't required medical attention. He thought about all the times Brooke had canceled family dinners at the last minute. All the bruises he'd noticed that she'd explained away as pregnancy clumsiness. "I'm 2 minutes away," he said. "Brooke, I want you to gather anything you might need for a hospital stay, your insurance cards, some comfortable clothes, your phone charger. Don't worry about much else." "That's not necessary," Clayton interjected. "I can drive her to the hospital myself." "There's no need to involve—" "You're not driving anywhere," Vernon cut him off. "And you're certainly not going to the hospital with her. You've done enough damage for one night." "Now listen here," Clayton said, his voice hardening. "I understand you're concerned about your sister, but I'm her husband. You don't get to make decisions about her medical care or who she sees." Vernon pulled into the parking garage of Brooke's luxury high-rise building. "Actually, as a licensed physician responding to a domestic violence situation, I have both the authority and the obligation to ensure she receives appropriate care. And as her brother, I have the right to protect her from further harm." He parked and took the elevator to the penthouse floor, his medical bag in one hand and his phone in the other. The elevator seemed to move impossibly slowly, and he found himself praying something he rarely did, that Brooke and the baby would be okay. When the elevator doors opened, he could hear voices from down the hall. Brooke's apartment door was slightly ajar, and he could see glass glittering on the floor even from the doorway. "Brooke," he called, stepping carefully into the foyer. "In the kitchen," she replied weakly. What Vernon saw when he entered the kitchen made his professional composure crack. Brooke sat on the floor against the kitchen island. Blood dried on her left cheek and smaller cuts visible on both arms. Broken crystal and glass covered the marble floor, in a pattern that suggested multiple impacts. The damage was extensive enough that it could only have been caused by deliberate force. Clayton stood across the room, his suit disheveled but otherwise unmarked. He watched nervously as Vernon knelt beside his sister and opened his medical bag. "Let me see," Vernon said gently, tilting Brooke's face toward the light. The cut on her cheek was about 2 inches long, but not deep enough to require stitches. More concerning were the multiple smaller cuts on her arms and the way she held herself protectively around her belly. "Any abdominal pain at all?" he asked, checking her pulse. "No, just the baby moving a lot," Brooke said. "But Vernon, I'm scared. What if something's wrong that we can't see?" "We're going to find out," he assured her, pulling out his phone to call for an ambulance. "I want you transported properly, with monitors for both you and the baby." "That's not necessary," Clayton said quickly. "I can drive her to the hospital. There's no need for an ambulance and all the attention that brings." Vernon looked up at his brother-in-law with undisguised contempt. "Attention? You mean the kind of attention that comes when medical professionals document domestic violence, the kind that leaves a paper trail?" "I resent the implication," Clayton said, his voice cold. "This was an accident, and I don't appreciate you turning it into something sinister." "The evidence speaks for itself," Vernon replied, taking photos of Brooke's injuries with his phone. "These injury patterns are consistent with flying glass from a high-velocity impact. The distribution suggests multiple objects were thrown with significant force." As he spoke, Vernon continued his examination, checking Brooke's blood pressure and listening to the baby's heartbeat with a portable fetal Doppler from his bag. The baby's heart rate was elevated but strong, and Brooke's vital signs were stable. "The baby sounds good," he told her, "but I want you monitored at the hospital for several hours to make sure there are no complications from the stress." "Vernon," Brooke said quietly, "there's something else." Clayton stepped forward. "Brooke, I don't think—" "This isn't the first time," she continued, ignoring her husband. "He's never used objects before. but he's pushed me, grabbed me hard enough to leave bruises. I just told myself it wasn't that bad because he never hit me with his hands. Vernon felt something cold settle in his stomach. Domestic violence often escalated during pregnancy, when the abuser felt threatened by the coming changes to the family dynamic. If Clayton had been using force before, tonight's incident represented a dangerous escalation. "We need to get you to the hospital now," he said, helping Brooke to her feet. "And we need to call the police." "Absolutely not," Clayton said sharply. "I forbid it. This is a private family matter, and I won't have my reputation destroyed over a misunderstanding." "Your reputation?" Vernon stared at him incredulously. "Your pregnant wife is bleeding from glass cuts you inflicted, and you're worried about your reputation." "I'm worried about what's best for this family," Clayton replied. "Brooke depends on me financially. If this gets out, if it affects my business, she and the baby will suffer too." Vernon recognized the manipulation tactic, making the victim responsible for the consequences of reporting the abuse. It was a classic move designed to maintain control even after violence had been exposed. "Brooke doesn't depend on you," Vernon said firmly. "She has family who will support her, and she has legal rights to marital assets. You're not her savior, Clayton. You're her abuser." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Abuser. Vernon watched Clayton's face cycle through expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a kind of cold fury that made him step protectively in front of his sister. "I think you need to leave," Clayton said quietly. "This is my home, and I want you out." "I'm not going anywhere without Brooke," Vernon replied. "And neither are you. She's coming with me to the hospital, and then we're going to discuss what happens next." "Actually," Brooke said, her voice stronger than it had been all evening, "I think I'd like to stay with Mom tonight. After the hospital, I mean—" Clayton's face went white. "Brooke, you can't be serious. You live here. Your life is here. You can't just run home to Mommy every time we have a disagreement." "A disagreement?" Vernon repeated. "You threw heavy objects at your pregnant wife. That's not a disagreement. It's assault." The sound of the elevator arriving interrupted their conversation. Vernon had called for an ambulance while examining Brooke, and now he could hear paramedics in the hallway. "Remember," he told his sister quietly, "tell them exactly what happened. Don't let him make you minimize this." As the paramedics entered with their equipment, Vernon realized this was just the beginning. The next few hours would determine whether Brooke and her baby would be safe, and whether Clayton would face any consequences for his actions. But looking at his sister's face bruised, cut, but finally showing a spark of the determination he remembered from their childhood, Vernon felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe tonight would be the night Brooke finally saw Clayton for what he really was. The paramedics began their assessment, and Vernon stepped back to let them work. But he kept his eyes on Clayton, watching for any sign that he might try to control the narrative or manipulate the situation further. This was far from over. The ambulance ride to Metropolitan General Hospital felt endless, despite taking only 8 minutes. Vernon sat beside the stretcher holding Brooke's hand, while the paramedic monitored both her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat through a portable fetal monitor. "Blood pressure is elevated but stable," the paramedic reported. "Fetal heart rate is 160, which is higher than normal but not immediately dangerous." Vernon nodded, his own heart racing as he watched the readouts. At 8 months pregnant, any stress on Brooke's system could trigger complications. The cuts on her face and arms were relatively minor, but the psychological trauma of being attacked by her husband could have serious medical consequences. "Any contractions?" Vernon asked his sister for the third time. "I don't think so," Brooke replied, but her voice was uncertain. "I feel some tightness in my belly, but it might just be the baby moving." The ambulance pulled into the hospital emergency bay, and Vernon felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that they were getting Brooke proper medical care, and dread about what they might find once she was thoroughly examined. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency department attending, met them at the ambulance doors. Vernon had worked with her many times and trusted her clinical judgment completely. "What do we have?" Dr. Chen asked as they transferred Brooke to a hospital gurney. 32-year-old female, 36 weeks pregnant, facial and arm lacerations from flying glass. Vernon reported, automatically shifting into professional mode. "Domestic violence situation, blood pressure elevated, fetal heart rate tachycardic but stable." Dr. Chen's expression hardened slightly at the words, domestic violence. She'd seen too many cases like this, and Vernon knew she would be thorough in her examination and documentation. Let's get her to Trauma Bay 3, Dr. Chen said. I want continuous fetal monitoring and a full OB consult. Have Dr. Chambers paged immediately. As they wheeled Brooke through the emergency department, Vernon noticed Clayton entering through the main doors. He'd driven himself to the hospital and was now striding toward them with the kind of confident authority he used in business meetings. Excuse me, Clayton said to Dr. Chen. I'm Clayton Marshall, Brooke's husband. I need to know what's happening with my wife and baby. Dr. Chen looked at Vernon, who shook his head slightly. Mr. Marshall, I'm Dr. Chen. Right now, we're taking your wife for examination. You can wait in the family area, and we'll update you when we have more information. I want to be with her, Clayton insisted. I have the right to be involved in her medical care. Actually, Vernon said, stepping between Clayton and the gurney, given that this is a domestic violence case, the patient's safety and comfort take precedence. Brooke, do you want Clayton in the examination room with you? Brooke looked at her husband, then at her brother. For a moment, Vernon saw the old Brooke, the confident woman who had built her own business and made her own decisions. No, she said quietly. I'd like some time to think. Clayton's face flushed with anger, but Dr. Chen was already moving the gurney away from him. Security will show you to the waiting area, she told him firmly. In Trauma Bay 3, a team of nurses quickly got to work. They cleaned and examined Brooke's cuts while Dr. Chen performed a comprehensive physical examination. The fetal monitor showed the baby's heart rate was still elevated, and Brooke reported feeling increased pressure in her abdomen. I'm going to do an ultrasound, Dr. Chen said, and I want Dr. Chambers here for a full obstetric evaluation. Dr. Pearl Chambers arrived within minutes. At 41, she was one of the most respected obstetricians at Metropolitan General, known for her skill in high-risk pregnancies. She took one look at the fetal monitor readings and frowned. How long has the heart rate been elevated? She asked. Since we arrived, Vernon replied. The stress from the attack seems to have affected both mother and baby. Dr. Chambers began her ultrasound examination, her expression growing more concerned as she studied the images on the screen. Vernon, I need you to look at this. Vernon moved to where he could see the monitor. What he saw made his blood run cold. There was a shadow along the edge of the placenta that shouldn't be there, a sign of placental abruption, a potentially life-threatening condition where the placenta separates from the uterine wall. How bad? He asked quietly. Partial abruption, but it's active. Dr. Chambers replied. The trauma from tonight's incident likely triggered it. We need to get her to the OR immediately. Brooke saw their expressions and gripped Vernon's hand. What's wrong? Is the baby okay? Dr. Chambers turned to her with the kind of calm authority that came from years of delivering difficult news. Brooke, the stress from tonight has caused part of your placenta to separate from your uterus. It's called placental abruption, and it means we need to deliver your baby right away. Right away! Brooke's voice was barely a whisper. But it's too early. I'm only 36 weeks. 36 weeks is considered late preterm, Dr. Chambers explained. The baby's lungs should be developed enough to breathe on their own, but there will probably be a NICU stay. Right now, the bigger concern is that if we don't deliver soon, both you and the baby could be in serious danger. Vernon felt his professional composure cracking. This was his sister, his nephew or niece, and he was watching their lives hang in the balance because of Clayton's violence. What are the risks? Brooke asked. With surgery, we're looking at normal C-section risks plus potential complications from the abruption, Dr. Chambers said honestly. Without surgery, the bleeding could become life-threatening for both of you. We need to move fast. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos as nurses prepared Brooke for emergency surgery. Vernon found himself pushed aside as the team worked, but he could hear Dr. Chambers on the phone with the anesthesiologist and NICU team. Vernon, Brooke called out as they prepared to move her to the operating room. If something happens to me, promise me you won't let Clayton control what happens to the baby? Nothing's going to happen to you, Vernon said firmly, but he could see the fear in her eyes. But I promise, I'll protect both of you. As they wheeled Brooke toward the elevator, Vernon caught sight of Clayton in the waiting area. He was pacing and talking on his phone, probably making business calls even as his wife faced emergency surgery. The image filled Vernon with a rage so pure it was almost blinding. "Dr. Hamilton," Dr. Chambers said, approaching him as the elevator doors closed. "I know this is your sister, but I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. Placental abruption at this stage has about a 15% chance of serious maternal complications and a 20% chance of fetal distress requiring intensive intervention." Vernon nodded, his throat too tight to speak. As a trauma surgeon, he understood the statistics. As a brother, they were meaningless numbers that couldn't capture his terror at possibly losing Brooke and her baby. "She's strong and healthy otherwise," Dr. Chambers continued. "That works in her favor, but I want you to be prepared for any outcome." 20 minutes later, Vernon sat in the surgical waiting area, still wearing his scrubs from his own shift that had ended hours ago. Clayton had stopped pacing and now sat rigidly in a chair across the room, his phone finally silent. "How long do these things usually take?" Clayton asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Depends on complications," Vernon replied without looking at him. "Could be 30 minutes, could be 2 hours." "This is all very dramatic," Clayton said, "but you're overreacting to what was essentially an accident. Brooke will recover, the baby will be fine, and we can put this whole misunderstanding behind us." Vernon turned to stare at his brother-in-law. "Misunderstanding, Clayton. Your wife is in emergency surgery because of injuries you inflicted. This isn't going away." "I've spoken to my attorney," Clayton said. "Brooke was clearly distraught and confused when she spoke to you. Pregnancy hormones can cause women to misinterpret situations, and trauma can alter memory. No one will believe she was deliberately attacked." The casual way he discussed manipulating the situation made Vernon's hands clench into fists. "Are you seriously planning to gaslight a woman who's fighting for her life right now?" "I'm planning to protect my family," Clayton replied, "which includes protecting Brooke from making accusations she'll regret when she's thinking more clearly." Before Vernon could respond, Dr. Chambers emerged from the surgical suite, still in her surgical gown. Her expression was cautiously relieved. "The baby is stable," she announced. "A girl, 5 pounds 3 ounces, breathing on her own but headed to the NICU for observation. Brooke did well during surgery, but we discovered more internal bleeding than the ultrasound showed. She's stable now, but the next few hours will be critical." Vernon felt his knees go weak with relief and residual fear. "Can I see her?" "She's in recovery now. Give us about 30 minutes to get her settled, then you can visit briefly." "What about the baby?" Clayton asked. "When can I see my daughter?" Dr. Chambers looked between the two men, clearly sensing the tension. "The NICU has specific visiting policies. Immediate family can visit, but given the circumstances of the delivery, we'll need to discuss the arrangement with social services." Clayton's face darkened. "Social services? What do they have to do with anything? Domestic violence cases involving pregnant women automatically trigger certain protocols." Dr. Chambers explained. "It's hospital policy to ensure the safety of both mother and child." "This is ridiculous," Clayton said, standing abruptly. "I demand to speak to the hospital administrator. I won't be treated like a criminal because of wild accusations from a woman who's clearly not thinking straight." Vernon stood as well, his patience finally snapping. "Those wild accusations are documented medical evidence. Clayton, the injury patterns, the glass fragments, the witness statements, it all points to deliberate violence against a pregnant woman." "You have no proof of intentional harm," Clayton shot back. "And when Brooke recovers and remembers what really happened, this whole fantasy will collapse." "Mr. Marshall," Dr. Chambers interrupted, "I think it would be best if you spoke with our social worker before attempting to visit either your wife or daughter. There are procedures we need to follow." Clayton looked between them, his mask of civilized concern finally slipping to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "Fine," he said, "but this isn't over. I have rights, and I have resources. Don't think you can manipulate this situation without consequences." He stalked away toward the elevators, leaving Vernon and Dr. Chambers alone in the waiting area. "Is Brooke really stable?" Vernon asked quietly. "She's stable but not out of the woods," Dr. Chambers admitted. "The internal bleeding was more extensive than we initially thought. We got it under control. But she lost a significant amount of blood. She'll need monitoring for the next 24 hours. Vernon sank back into his chair, the weight of the evening finally hitting him. His sister had nearly died. His niece was in the NICU, and Clayton was already planning how to manipulate the situation to avoid consequences. But Brooke was alive, and she'd finally seen Clayton's true nature. Maybe that would be enough to break the cycle of control and abuse that had defined their marriage. Vernon closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of hope. The worst might be over, but the real fight was just beginning. The next morning, Vernon sat beside Brooke's hospital bed, watching her sleep. She looked pale and fragile against the white sheets, with bandages covering the cuts on her face and arms. The baby his niece Hope, as Brooke had decided to name her, was stable in the NICU, though she would need several more weeks of monitoring. "Vernon?" Brooke's voice was weak as she opened her eyes. "Is Hope okay?" "She's perfect," Vernon assured her, taking her hand. 5 pounds, 3 ounces of pure determination. The NICU team says she's breathing well on her own, which is excellent for 36 weeks. Brooke smiled for the first time since the attack, then winced as the movement pulled at the cut on her cheek. "Can I see her?" "Once you're cleared to move around," Vernon said. "Dr. Chambers wants to monitor you for another day because of the blood loss." "Blood loss?" Brooke looked confused. "I thought the surgery went well." Vernon hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. "You had more internal bleeding than we initially realized. The placental abruption was more severe than the ultrasound showed. You lost about 1 liter of blood during surgery." Brooke was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. Clayton's attack could have killed us both. "Yes," Vernon said simply. There was no point in sugarcoating the reality. "Where is he now?" "Downstairs talking to the social worker and hospital security. He's been demanding to see you and Hope, but hospital policy requires a safety evaluation first." Brooke closed her eyes. "He's going to be furious about the involvement of social services. He hates anything that might affect his public image. His image should be the least of his concerns right now." Vernon said, "Brooke, I documented your injuries last night, and I've been in contact with Detective Gary Thornton from the Domestic Violence Unit. They want to interview you when you're feeling stronger." "Police!" Brooke's eyes snapped open. "Vernon, I'm not sure I'm ready for that." "You don't have to decide anything right now," Vernon said gently. "But I want you to understand your options. What Clayton did was assault, and in many states, domestic violence during pregnancy carries enhanced penalties." Before Brooke could respond, there was a knock at the door. Nurse Colleen Murphy, one of Vernon's colleagues from the trauma department, peered in. "Sorry to interrupt," Colleen said, "but there's been a situation downstairs. I thought Dr. Hamilton should know." Vernon stepped into the hallway with her. Colleen was 29 and had worked trauma nursing for 5 years. She'd seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the warning signs. "What kind of situation?" Vernon asked. "Mr. Marshall tried to force his way into the NICU," Colleen reported. "Security had to remove him. He was demanding to see the baby and claiming that hospital staff were violating his parental rights." Vernon felt a chill. Attempting to bypass hospital security was escalation behavior, a sign that Clayton was losing control and becoming more desperate. "There's more," Colleen continued. "He cornered Maria Santos, the social worker, in the elevator and tried to intimidate her into changing her assessment. He told her that he had connections on the hospital board and could have her fired." "Did he threaten her directly?" "Not in so many words, but Maria was pretty shaken up. She's been doing this for 15 years and says she's never had a family member act so aggressively during an evaluation." Vernon rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache building. Clayton was showing all the classic signs of an abuser whose control was slipping, escalating demands. Attempts at intimidation, threats against support systems. "Where is he now?" "Hospital security escorted him off the premises about an hour ago," Colleen said. "But Vernon, there's something else you should know. I overheard him on the phone in the parking garage before security removed him. He was talking to someone about controlling the narrative and managing the situation before it gets out of hand." Vernon felt his blood chill. In his experience, when abusers started talking about controlling narratives, it usually meant they were planning to discredit their victims or manipulate evidence. Did he see you listening? I don't think so. I was coming back from break and heard him through the stairwell door. But Vernon, he sounded different, cold and calculating, not like the charming businessman he usually pretends to be. Vernon thanked Colleen and returned to Brooke's room, his mind racing. Clayton's behavior was escalating exactly as he'd feared it would. The mask was coming off, revealing the predator beneath the polished exterior. What was that about? Brooke asked when he sat back down. Vernon debated how much to tell her, then decided she needed to understand the situation fully. Clayton tried to force his way into the NICU and threatened the social worker. Hospital security had to remove him. Brooke's face went pale. He threatened the social worker, Vernon. He's never done anything like that before. He's always been so careful about his public image. That's exactly what worries me, Vernon said. When abusers start acting out in public, it usually means they're losing control, and desperate people do dangerous things. You think he might try to hurt me again? I think he's going to try to manipulate the situation to make you look unstable or unreliable, Vernon said. He was talking on the phone about controlling the narrative. That suggests he's planning some kind of campaign to discredit you. Brooke was quiet for several minutes, staring at the ceiling. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been since the attack. Vernon, I need to tell you something. About our marriage. About things that have been happening for months. What kind of things? Financial control, for starters, Brooke said. About 2 years ago, Clayton convinced me to put all our accounts in his name for tax efficiency. I haven't had access to my own money since then. Vernon felt his anger building again. Financial abuse was often the foundation that made other forms of control possible. What about your inheritance from Dad's life insurance? Clayton invested it in his company, Brooke said quietly. He said it would give us a better return than traditional investments. But I don't have any documentation of that investment, and when I've asked about it, he says I don't understand the complexities of business finance. Brooke, that inheritance was over $200,000. I know. Tears started forming in her eyes. Vernon, I think I've been incredibly stupid. All these years, I thought I was living this glamorous life as the wife of a successful CEO, but I don't own anything. I don't have any money. I don't even have access to our joint checking account. Vernon's hands clenched into fists. Clayton hadn't just been physically and emotionally abusive. He'd been systematically stripping Brooke of her financial independence and security. There's more, Brooke continued. The social isolation started gradually. First, he convinced me that my business was too stressful and I should focus on starting a family. Then he started criticizing my friends, saying they were jealous of our success or bad influences. Over the past year, I've barely seen anyone except at his company events. What about Mom? You've been visiting her regularly. Only when Clayton was traveling, Brooke admitted. He said family dinners were boring and that Mom was too critical of him. I've been lying to both of you, making excuses about why he couldn't come or why I had to leave early. Vernon realized that Clayton had been methodically destroying Brooke's support systems, isolating her from anyone who might recognize the abuse or offer help. It was a textbook pattern, executed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Brooke, none of this is your fault, Vernon said firmly. Clayton is a practiced manipulator. He targeted you specifically because you're successful and independent. Those are threats to his need for control. But I let it happen, Brooke said, tears flowing freely now. I gave up my business, my friends, my financial independence. I turned myself into exactly the kind of victim he wanted. You trusted your husband, Vernon said. That's what marriage is supposed to be about. Clayton violated that trust systematically and deliberately. There was another knock at the door, and Detective Gary Thornton entered after being waved in by Vernon. At 52, Thornton was a veteran of the domestic violence unit with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. Ms. Hamilton, he said gently, I'm Detective Thornton. I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, and I don't want to pressure you, but if you're willing to talk, I'd like to hear what happened last night. Brooke looked at Vernon, who nodded encouragingly. It's your choice, he said, but Detective Thornton specializes in domestic violence cases. He understands what you're going through. What happens if I tell you everything? Brooke asked the detective. That depends on what you tell me and what evidence we can gather, Thornton replied honestly. But I want you to understand that domestic violence during pregnancy is taken very seriously by the courts. If we can prove that Mr. Marshall's actions endangered you and your baby, he could face significant charges. And if I don't press charges, the district attorney's office can sometimes proceed without victim cooperation if the evidence is strong enough. Thornton explained, but cases are always stronger when the victim is willing to testify. Brooke was quiet for a long moment, then looked at Vernon. What do you think I should do? I think you should tell the truth, Vernon said. Not for revenge, but to protect yourself and hope. Clayton's behavior is escalating, and men like him don't stop on their own. Brooke nodded slowly. Okay, she said to Detective Thornton. What do you want to know? For the next hour, Brooke told her story not just about the previous night, but about the gradual escalation of control and abuse over their 5-year marriage. Thornton took detailed notes and asked careful questions, building a comprehensive picture of domestic violence that went far beyond a single violent incident. When they finished, Thornton closed his notebook and looked at Brooke with compassion. Miss Hamilton, I want you to know that you've been very brave today. Speaking up about abuse is never easy, especially when the abuser has significant social and financial power. What happens now? Brooke asked. I'll be filing charges for domestic violence and assault, Thornton said. Given that you were pregnant at the time of the attack and required emergency surgery, the charges will likely include aggravated assault. Mr. Marshall will be arrested within the next few hours. As Detective Thornton left, Vernon felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Clayton would face legal consequences for his actions, but men like him rarely accepted defeat quietly. The next few weeks would be crucial in determining whether Brooke and Hope would truly be safe. Vernon, Brooke said quietly, I'm scared about what happens next. We'll figure it out together, Vernon promised. You and Hope are going to be okay. I'll make sure of it. But even as he spoke the words, Vernon couldn't shake the feeling that Clayton wouldn't go down without a fight. And when cornered, dangerous men became even more dangerous. 3 days later, Vernon sat in the hospital cafeteria across from his mother, Maureen Hamilton, watching her struggle to process everything that had happened. At 64, Maureen had raised 2 children, largely on her own after their father's death, and she'd always been the family's moral compass. Now she looked smaller than Vernon remembered, as if the weight of Brooke's situation had physically diminished her. I just don't understand how I missed it, Maureen said for the 3rd time, stirring her coffee absently. 5 years, Vernon. For 5 years, I thought Brooke was happy. Clayton's good at hiding his true nature, Vernon replied. That's how abusers operate. They create a public persona that's completely different from who they are in private. But there must have been signs, Maureen insisted. The way she started canceling family dinners, how she seemed nervous when Clayton was around, those bruises she explained away as pregnancy clumsiness. I should have seen it. Vernon reached across the table and covered his mother's hand with his own. Mom, even I didn't see the full picture until Monday night. Clayton was methodical about isolating Brooke and controlling the narrative. You can't blame yourself for believing what she told you. Maureen was quiet for a moment, then looked up with the fierce determination Vernon remembered from his childhood. What can I do to help? How do we make sure this never happens again? The most important thing is supporting Brooke's decisions, Vernon said. She's going to need time to rebuild her confidence and independence. Clayton spent years convincing her that she couldn't trust her own judgment. Where will she live? She can't go back to that penthouse. We're working on that, Vernon said. Gwendolyn Pierce, remember Brooke's friend from college who became a family attorney? She's been researching Brooke's legal options. As if summoned by his words, Gwendolyn Pierce appeared at their table. At 45, Gwen had built a successful practice specializing in family law and domestic relations. She'd maintained her friendship with Brooke over the years despite Clayton's attempts to discourage it. I'm sorry I'm late, Gwen said, sitting down with a thick folder of documents. I've been at the courthouse filing emergency motions. What kind of motions? Vernon asked. Restraining order, emergency custody provisions for Hope, and motions to freeze marital assets, Gwen replied. Clayton's been liquidating accounts since Tuesday. He's moved over $300,000 to offshore holdings in the past 48 hours. Vernon felt his blood pressure spike. He's hiding money. Not just hiding it, stealing it, Gwen said grimly. I've been reviewing the financial records that Brooke gave me access to, and the pattern is clear. He's been systematically moving assets out of her reach for months, probably planning for this contingency. Maureen looked confused. What does that mean exactly? It means Clayton has been planning to leave Brooke with nothing if she ever tried to leave him. Gwen explained. The offshore accounts, the business investments in her name that she doesn't control, the debt he's accumulated against their property, it's all designed to make her financially dependent, even in divorce. Can we stop him? Vernon asked. I've filed for an emergency asset freeze, but it will take time to unwind everything he's done, Gwen said. The good news is that domestic violence during pregnancy gives us significant leverage in family court. Judges take a very dim view of men who endanger their pregnant wives. Vernon's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and felt his stomach clench. Speak of the devil, he said. Clayton wants to meet with me. Says it's important. Don't do it, Gwen said immediately. He's probably trying to manipulate you into convincing Brooke to drop the charges. Or gather information he can use against her, Maureen added, surprising them both with her insight. Vernon considered their warnings, but something made him hesitate. What if he says something incriminating if I record the conversation? It might help Brooke's case. Vernon, as Brooke's attorney, I'm advising you not to meet with Clayton without legal representation, Gwen said firmly. Men like him are dangerous when they're cornered. Before Vernon could respond, his pager went off. Emergency surgery, a multi-vehicle accident with multiple trauma victims. I have to go, he said, standing. We'll discuss this later. As Vernon hurried toward the trauma bay, his mind was torn between his professional responsibilities and his family crisis. The surgery lasted 4 hours, requiring all of his concentration and skill to save 2 critically injured patients. But even as he worked, part of his mind kept returning to Brooke and Hope. When he finally emerged from surgery, exhausted but successful, he found Nurse Colleen waiting for him with a concerned expression. Vernon, there's been a situation, she said. Clayton Marshall showed up here about an hour ago, demanding to see you. When security told him you were in surgery, he started making threats. What kind of threats? He said the hospital would regret protecting false accusations against him, Colleen reported. He also mentioned that he had friends on the board of directors and could make things difficult for staff who interfered in his family matters. Vernon felt a chill run down his spine. Clayton was escalating his intimidation tactics, moving beyond family members to threaten anyone who supported Brooke. There's more, Colleen continued. He tried to get information about Brooke's condition from the nurses' station. When they refused, he claimed he had a right to know about his wife's medical status. Nurse Jenkins finally had to call security to remove him. Where is he now? Gone, but not quietly. He told security that this wasn't over and that people would face consequences for their actions. Vernon realized that Clayton was systematically trying to isolate Brooke by intimidating her support system. It was a calculated campaign designed to make everyone afraid to help her. His phone rang. It was Gwen. Vernon, we have a problem, she said without preamble. Clayton's filed countermotions claiming that Brooke is mentally unstable due to postpartum depression and pregnancy hormones. He's requesting emergency custody of Hope and asking for a psychiatric evaluation of Brooke. On what grounds? He's claiming that her accusations against him are delusional and that she's a danger to herself and the baby, Gwen explained. He's also filed a motion to have you removed as Brooke's medical decision-maker, claiming family bias. Vernon felt the walls closing in. Clayton was using the legal system to continue his abuse, weaponizing Brooke's vulnerability and their family relationships against them. What's our timeline? Vernon asked. Emergency hearing tomorrow morning, Gwen replied. The judge will decide on temporary custody and whether to order a psychiatric evaluation. Vernon, I need you to be very careful about what you say and do. Clayton's lawyers are going to portray you as an overzealous brother who's manipulating a vulnerable woman. After hanging up, Vernon made his way to Brooke's room. She was sitting up in bed, looking stronger physically but emotionally fragile. Hope's bassinet was beside the bed. The baby had been released from the NICU that morning and was now rooming with her mother. How are you feeling? Vernon asked, admiring his niece's tiny perfect features. Better physically, Brooke said, but terrified about tomorrow's hearing. Gwen explained what Clayton is trying to do. We're not going to let him take Hope, Vernon said firmly. The evidence of his violence is too strong. But what if the judge believes him? Brooke asked. Clayton can be very convincing, and I know how I must look emotional, dependent, making serious accusations against a successful businessman. Vernon sat down beside her bed. Brooke, you survived years of systematic abuse and still found the courage to protect your daughter. That's not the behavior of someone who's mentally unstable. Vernon, Brooke said quietly, there's something else I need to tell you about why I'm so scared of what Clayton might do. What is it? Brooke looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. About 6 months ago, Clayton started talking about what would happen if something happened to me during childbirth. He said he'd already made arrangements for Hope to be raised by his family if necessary. Vernon felt ice in his veins. What kind of arrangements? Legal documents giving his parents guardianship rights, Brooke said. He claimed it was just standard estate planning, but now I think he was preparing for the possibility that he might need to remove me from Hope's life. The implications hit Vernon like a physical blow. Clayton hadn't just been preparing to financially destroy Brooke. He'd been planning to take her child away if she ever tried to leave. Do you have copies of those documents? They're in the safe at the penthouse, Brooke said, along with our wills and insurance policies. Vernon, what if he's been planning this for months? What if attacking me was just the first step in a larger plan? Vernon realized that they'd been thinking too small. This wasn't just about domestic violence or even financial abuse. Clayton had been systematically preparing to destroy Brooke's life and take complete control of their child. We need to tell Gwen about this immediately, Vernon said, reaching for his phone. Vernon, Brooke said, stopping him. I'm scared about tomorrow. What if I lose hope? What if Clayton convinces the judge that I'm unfit? Vernon took his sister's hand, looking into eyes that reminded him of the little girl he'd protected after their father died. That's not going to happen, he said. I promise you, Brooke, whatever it takes, whatever I have to do, Clayton is not going to take hope away from you. But even as he made the promise, Vernon wondered if he'd be able to keep it. Clayton had money, lawyers, and a carefully constructed public image. All they had was the truth, and Vernon was beginning to understand that the truth wasn't always enough to protect the innocent. Tomorrow's hearing would determine not just custody of Hope, but whether justice was possible when the abuser had all the advantages of wealth and social standing. Vernon looked at his sleeping niece and made a silent vow. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever it cost him personally or professionally, he would not let Clayton win. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock Friday morning in family court. Vernon arrived early to find Gwendolyn Pierce already there, surrounded by boxes of documents and looking like she'd been working all night. Please tell me you have good news, Vernon said, sitting beside her at the plaintiff's table. Mixed news, Gwen replied, not looking up from her notes. The good news is that Detective Thornton's report is very thorough, and the medical evidence clearly supports Brooke's account of the attack. The bad news is that Clayton has hired Morrison, Wells and Associates. Vernon recognized the name Morrison. Wells was one of the most expensive and ruthless family law firms in the city. They specialized in protecting wealthy clients in high-stakes divorce and custody battles. How bad is that for us? They're already playing dirty, Gwen said grimly. They've subpoenaed your medical records, claiming that your history of treating trauma victims has made you overly suspicious and prone to seeing abuse where none exists. That's ridiculous. It doesn't matter if it's ridiculous, it's their strategy. Gwen explained. They're going to portray you as an emotionally compromised brother who's manipulating his vulnerable sister. They've also hired a forensic accountant to claim that Brooke's accusations about financial abuse are motivated by greed. Before Vernon could respond, the courtroom doors opened and Clayton entered with his legal team. Vernon was struck by how different his brother-in-law looked. Gone was the disheveled, angry man from the hospital. Today, Clayton was immaculately groomed, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of wounded dignity. Behind Clayton came an older couple Vernon didn't recognize, well-dressed, conservative, with the kind of understated wealth that spoke of old money. The woman had Clayton's eyes and the same calculating expression. Clayton's parents, Gwen whispered, Margaret and Charles Marshall. They're here to testify about their son's character and their willingness to help raise Hope if Brooke is deemed unfit. Vernon felt his stomach clench. Clayton wasn't just fighting for custody, he was building a case to have Brooke declared an unfit mother so his family could take complete control of Hope. Judge Dorothy Fairfield entered the courtroom, and Vernon felt a small spark of hope. At 58, Judge Fairfield had a reputation for being tough but fair, especially in cases involving domestic violence. She'd been a prosecutor before becoming a judge and understood the dynamics of abuse. This is an emergency hearing regarding temporary custody of Hope Marshall. Born Monday night to Brooke Hamilton and Clayton Marshall, Judge Fairfield began. Mr. Morrison, you filed a motion for emergency custody. Please present your argument. Robert Morrison, Clayton's lead attorney, stood with the confidence of someone who'd won most of his cases through intimidation and superior resources. Your Honor, we're here today because of false and malicious accusations made by Mrs. Marshall against my client. These accusations appear to be the result of postpartum psychological distress combined with a family member's inappropriate influence. Vernon watched as Morrison painted a picture of Brooke as an unstable woman being manipulated by her overzealous brother. He cited the stress of fertility treatments, the hormonal changes of pregnancy, and the trauma of emergency surgery as factors that had compromised her judgment. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Mrs. Marshall has been unable to provide for herself financially and has demonstrated poor decision-making regarding the family's assets. Mr. Marshall's parents are prepared to provide a stable, secure environment for baby Hope, while Mrs. Marshall receives the psychiatric care she clearly needs. When Morrison finished, Gwen stood to present their case. She methodically laid out the evidence of Clayton's abuse, the medical records, the police report, the pattern of financial control, and the systematic isolation of Brooke from her support systems. Your Honor, Gwen concluded, this is not a case of postpartum depression or family manipulation. This is a classic pattern of domestic violence that escalated to the point where Mr. Marshall's actions required emergency surgery to save both mother and child. The evidence is overwhelming and objective. Judge Fairfield reviewed the documents for several minutes before speaking. I'd like to hear testimony from the parties involved. Mrs. Marshall, are you prepared to testify today? Brooke stood from where she'd been sitting behind the defense table. She still looked pale and fragile, with visible bandages on her face and arms, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready. For the next hour, Brooke recounted the progression of abuse in her marriage from the subtle control and isolation to the escalating violence that culminated in Monday night's attack. She spoke clearly and calmly, providing specific examples and dates whenever possible. Morrison's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned every detail of her account, suggested that pregnancy hormones had affected her memory, and implied that her injuries could have been self-inflicted for attention, but Brooke remained composed, never becoming defensive or emotional despite the aggressive questioning. Mrs. Marshall, Morrison said in conclusion, isn't it true that you stand to gain millions of dollars in a divorce settlement if these accusations are believed? I don't want millions of dollars, Brooke replied quietly. I want my daughter to be safe. I want to rebuild my life without fear. Money can't undo what Clayton did to us. When it was Vernon's turn to testify, Morrison immediately attacked his credibility. Dr. Hamilton, isn't it true that you've disliked my client since he began dating your sister? I was concerned about some of his controlling behaviors, Vernon admitted, but I hoped I was wrong. And isn't it true that your experience treating trauma victims has made you prone to seeing violence and abuse in normal disagreements? No, Vernon said firmly. My experience has taught me to recognize the signs of systematic abuse. What I saw Monday night wasn't a disagreement, it was attempted murder. The phrase hung in the courtroom like a thunderclap. Morrison objected, but Judge Fairfield allowed the statement to stand. Dr. Hamilton, she said, please explain why you believe this was attempted murder rather than domestic violence. Vernon took a deep breath. Your Honor, the glass fragments from the attack showed high-velocity impact patterns consistent with objects thrown with significant force. The placement of the injuries and the amount of broken glass suggested multiple impacts deliberately aimed at causing maximum damage. In my medical opinion, if Mrs. Marshall hadn't turned to protect her belly, the crystal decanter would have struck her directly in the head or face with potentially fatal results. Judge Fairfield made notes as Vernon spoke. When he finished, she called a recess to review all the evidence and testimony. During the break, Vernon noticed Clayton's parents approaching Gwen and Brooke. Margaret Marshall was a small, elegant woman with steel gray hair and cold eyes. "Mrs. Pierce," Margaret said in a cultured voice, "perhaps we could discuss a reasonable arrangement that would benefit everyone, especially little Hope." "What kind of arrangement?" Gwen asked suspiciously. "Clayton is obviously going through a difficult time," Margaret continued. "Perhaps if Brooke were willing to undergo voluntary psychological evaluation and treatment, we could arrange for supervised visitation while Hope stays with us temporarily." Vernon saw the trap immediately. They wanted Brooke to voluntarily surrender custody while submitting to psychological evaluation that they would use to declare her permanently unfit. "Mrs. Marshall," Brooke said quietly, "I appreciate your concern, but Hope belongs with her mother." Margaret's pleasant expression didn't change, but her voice turned icy. "My dear, you're clearly not thinking rationally. You've made serious accusations against our son that could destroy his career and reputation. Surely you can see that some sort of mental health intervention is necessary." "The only intervention that's necessary," Vernon said, standing between Margaret and his sister, "is protecting Hope from a family that enables and excuses violence." Margaret's mask finally slipped, revealing the same calculating coldness that Vernon had seen in Clayton. "Dr. Hamilton, you're interfering in family matters that don't concern you. My son has resources and connections that you can't imagine. It would be wise to consider what's best for everyone involved." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Vernon realized that Clayton's entire family was involved in the campaign to discredit Brooke and take control of Hope. Judge Fairfield returned to the courtroom and called everyone to order. "After reviewing all the evidence and testimony," she began, "I'm prepared to make my ruling on temporary custody." Vernon held his breath, knowing that the next few words would determine Hope's future. "The evidence of domestic violence in this case is compelling and well documented." Judge Fairfield continued, "Mr. Marshall's actions resulted in emergency surgery for his pregnant wife and could have been fatal for both mother and child. Under no circumstances will I award custody to someone who has demonstrated such dangerous behavior." Vernon felt relief flooding through him, but Judge Fairfield wasn't finished. "However, I am concerned about Mrs. Marshall's emotional state and support system. She's been through significant trauma and will need time to recover and establish independence." Vernon's relief turned to worry. Was the judge about to compromise, therefore? Judge Fairfield concluded, "Temporary custody of Hope Marshall will remain with her mother, Brooke Hamilton. However, Mrs. Hamilton will reside with a family member who can provide support and supervision. Dr. Vernon Hamilton, are you prepared to serve as temporary guardian and support person for your sister and niece?" "Yes, Your Honor," Vernon said immediately. "Mr. Marshall will have no contact with either Mrs. Hamilton or baby Hope pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. A restraining order will remain in effect, and any violation will result in immediate arrest." Clayton's face went white with rage, but his attorney quickly whispered something that made him stay seated. As they left the courtroom, Vernon felt cautiously optimistic. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. Clayton had resources, connections, and a family willing to support his campaign against Brooke. But for now, Hope was safe with her mother, and that was what mattered most. Outside the courthouse, Gwen gathered them together. "This is just the beginning," she warned. "Clayton's going to appeal, and he'll use every resource at his disposal to overturn this decision. We need to be prepared for a long fight." Vernon looked at his sister, who was holding Hope against her chest with fierce protectiveness. "Then we'll be ready," he said. "Whatever it takes." 2 weeks later, Vernon sat in the witness room of the county courthouse, reviewing his notes one final time before the criminal trial began. Clayton had been charged with domestic violence, aggravated assault, and endangering the welfare of a child. If convicted on all counts, he could face up to 10 years in prison. The prosecution had built their case around the medical evidence, police reports, and testimony from hospital staff who'd witnessed Clayton's behavior. But Vernon knew that his testimony would be crucial. He was both a medical expert and the primary witness to the aftermath of the attack. District Attorney Sarah Kim had been preparing him for the defense's strategy. "They're going to attack your objectivity," she'd warned. "Morrison will claim that you're too emotionally involved to provide reliable testimony, and that your bias against Clayton has colored your medical assessment The medical evidence speaks for itself, Vernon had replied. The injury patterns, the blood loss, the placental abruption, these are objective facts, not subjective interpretations. Facts can be twisted, D.A. Kim had cautioned. Morrison is very good at creating doubt, especially when the victim is vulnerable and the defendant is wealthy and sympathetic. Now, waiting to be called to testify, Vernon reflected on how much had changed in 2 weeks. Brooke and Hope were staying in his guest bedroom, slowly rebuilding their lives. Brooke was seeing a therapist twice a week and working with Gwen to untangle the financial web Clayton had created. Hope was thriving, gaining weight and developing the alert curiosity of a healthy baby. But Clayton hadn't given up. His parents had hired private investigators to dig into Brooke's past, looking for anything that could be used to discredit her. They'd also been spreading rumors in their social circles that Brooke was mentally unstable and had made false accusations for financial gain. Dr. Hamilton. A bailiff appeared at the door. You're up. Vernon walked into the courtroom, which was packed with observers. He recognized several of Clayton's business associates and country club friends, all there to show support for the defendant. Clayton himself sat at the defense table, looking like the successful businessman. He was confident, well-dressed, and completely in control. Kim began with basic questions about Vernon's medical credentials and experience treating trauma victims. She established his expertise methodically, building the foundation for his more technical testimony. Dr. Hamilton, please describe Mrs. Hamilton's condition when you arrived at her apartment on the night of the attack. Vernon had rehearsed this testimony, but speaking the words aloud in front of Clayton still made his anger flare. My sister was sitting on the floor, bleeding from multiple cuts on her face and arms. There was broken glass scattered across a wide area, indicating multiple high-velocity impacts. Her injuries were consistent with flying glass fragments from objects thrown with significant force. Based on your medical examination, could these injuries have been accidental? No, Vernon said firmly. The pattern and severity of the glass distribution, combined with the injury locations, indicated deliberate violence. If someone had simply dropped or accidentally knocked over glassware, the damage would have been localized and the glass fragments would show different impact patterns. D.A. Kim moved to a chart displaying photos of the crime scene. Dr. Hamilton, can you explain what these photographs show about the force involved? Vernon stood and pointed to the evidence photos. The glass embedded in the kitchen wall shows impact velocities consistent with objects thrown with considerable force. The spray pattern indicates multiple impacts from different trajectories. This level of damage requires deliberate action, not accidental dropping. What was Mrs. Hamilton's medical condition when you examined her? She had multiple lacerations requiring treatment, elevated blood pressure indicating severe stress, and signs of early placental abruption, a potentially life-threatening pregnancy complication that can be triggered by trauma. Kim led Vernon through the timeline of events, from his arrival at the apartment through the emergency surgery. His testimony was clinical and precise, focusing on medical facts rather than emotional reactions. Dr. Hamilton, in your professional opinion, what would have happened if Mrs. Hamilton hadn't received immediate medical intervention? Both she and the baby could have died, Vernon said without hesitation. Placental abruption can cause fatal hemorrhaging in the mother and oxygen deprivation in the fetus. The delay of even 30 minutes could have been catastrophic. When D.A. Kim finished, Robert Morrison rose for cross-examination. Vernon had been dreading this moment. Morrison's reputation for destroying witnesses was well-deserved. Dr. Hamilton, Morrison began smoothly, you love your sister very much, don't you? Yes, I do. And you've been protective of her since childhood, particularly after your father's death when she was only 7 years old. Vernon saw the trap but had to answer honestly. Yes. So when she called you that night, crying and claiming she'd been hurt, your first instinct was to protect her rather than objectively assess the situation. My first instinct was to provide medical care, Vernon corrected, which I did, following standard protocols for trauma assessment. Morrison smiled slightly. Dr. Hamilton, isn't it true that you disliked Mr. Marshall from the beginning of his relationship with your sister? I had concerns about some of his behaviors, Vernon admitted. What kind of behaviors? Vernon chose his words carefully. He seemed to discourage Brooke's independence in professional relationships. He was often critical of her decisions and dismissive of her opinions. In other words, you thought he wasn't good enough for your sister. I thought he was controlling. And when she called you that night, reporting that her controlling husband had finally crossed the line into violence, that confirmed everything you'd suspected about him, didn't it? Vernon felt the questioning shifting into dangerous territory. What confirmed my concerns was the medical evidence, the injuries, the stress-induced complications, the need for emergency surgery. Morrison moved to attack Vernon's professional assessment. Dr. Hamilton, you specialize in trauma surgery. Correct. You see the worst injuries, the most violent crimes, the most severe accidents? That's correct. Doesn't that exposure make you more likely to interpret minor injuries as signs of serious violence? No, Vernon said firmly. It makes me better able to distinguish between accidental and intentional trauma patterns. But you're not a domestic violence expert, are you? You don't have specialized training in recognizing abuse patterns. I have extensive experience treating victims of domestic violence as part of my trauma practice. Morrison pulled out a thick file. Dr. Hamilton, I have here records of 17 cases in the past 3 years where you've reported suspected domestic violence to authorities. Isn't that an unusually high number? Vernon felt his heart sink. Morrison had done his research. I report suspected abuse when medical evidence supports that conclusion. 17 cases, Dr. Hamilton. And in how many of those cases were the suspected abusers actually convicted? Vernon knew where this was heading. Conviction rates don't determine the validity of medical assessments. Many factors affect prosecution outcomes. Please answer the question. How many convictions? 4, Vernon admitted quietly. 4 out of 17, Morrison repeated, letting the number hang in the courtroom. That's less than a 25% accuracy rate. Wouldn't you say? D.A. Kim objected, and Judge Fairfield sustained it. But the damage was done. Morrison had made Vernon look like someone who saw abuse everywhere, regardless of evidence. Dr. Hamilton, Morrison continued, on the night in question, did you take photographs of the crime scene before anything was disturbed? I took photos of my sister's injuries, but not the kitchen where the alleged attack occurred. Vernon realized his mistake. No, I was focused on providing medical care. So you have no photographic evidence of the glass distribution patterns you've described so confidently? The police documented the scene, but you didn't, did you? You immediately began moving your sister, disturbing potential evidence, because you assumed a crime had been committed? Vernon felt the walls closing in. Morrison was systematically dismantling his credibility, making it appear that his protective instincts had compromised his professional judgment. Dr. Hamilton, Morrison said, moving in for the kill. Isn't it possible that Mrs. Marshall, in her emotionally fragile state during late pregnancy, misinterpreted an accident as an attack, and that you, due to your pre-existing bias against Mr. Marshall and your tendency to see violence where none exists, supported her misinterpretation? No, Vernon said, but he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Morrison had shaken his confidence in his own perceptions. Isn't it possible that Mr. Marshall, stressed from business pressures and concerned about his pregnant wife's emotional state, accidentally knocked over glassware during an argument, and that the resulting injuries were truly accidental? Vernon looked across the courtroom at Clayton, who was watching with an expression of wounded dignity. For just a moment, Vernon wondered if Morrison might be right. Had his protective instincts and dislike of Clayton colored his interpretation of the evidence? Then he saw Brooke in the gallery, holding Hope protectively, and remembered the terror in her voice when she called him. He remembered the calculated coldness in Clayton's eyes at the hospital, the threats against hospital staff, the systematic financial abuse that Gwen had uncovered. No, Vernon said, his voice stronger now. The medical evidence is clear. Mrs. Hamilton was the victim of deliberate violence that endangered both her life and her baby's life. That's not interpretation or bias, that's medical fact. Sorry, Morrison tried several more approaches, but Vernon held firm. He'd been shaken, but not broken. When the cross-examination finally ended, Vernon felt like he'd survived a boxing match. As he left the witness stand, Vernon caught sight of Clayton's parents in the gallery. Margaret Marshall was taking notes, probably planning their next attack on Brooke's credibility. This trial was just one front in a larger war. During the lunch recess, D.A. Kim found Vernon in the hallway. "You did well," she said. "Morrison scored some points, but you recovered. The jury saw that you're committed to the truth, not just protecting your sister." "Did I hurt Brooks' case?" "Morrison was always going to attack your credibility. It's his only real defense strategy. But the medical evidence is strong, and your testimony supported it. We'll see how the jury responds." That afternoon, Brooke took the stand. Vernon watched from the gallery as his sister recounted the progression of abuse in her marriage, the financial control, the isolation, and finally the violent attack that had nearly killed her and Hope. Morrison's cross-examination of Brooke was even more brutal than his questioning of Vernon. He suggested she was lying for financial gain, that postpartum depression had affected her judgment, that her accusations were motivated by a desire for revenge against a successful husband. But Brooke remained calm and consistent, never becoming defensive or emotional despite the aggressive questioning. When Morrison finished, she looked directly at the jury. "I know how this must look," she said quietly. "A wife accusing her wealthy husband, a woman with no money or power fighting against someone with every advantage. But I'm not here for revenge or money. I'm here because my daughter deserves to grow up in a world where violence has consequences, where the truth matters more than wealth or status." As the trial continued over the next 3 days, Vernon watched the jury's faces, trying to gauge their reaction. Some seemed sympathetic to Brooke. Others appeared skeptical. The case could go either way. On Friday afternoon, the jury began deliberations. Vernon, Brooke, and Gwen waited in a nearby conference room, tension filling the air like electricity before a storm. "Whatever happens," Brooke said, bouncing Hope gently, "we've told the truth. We've done everything we could." Vernon nodded, but privately he was terrified. If Clayton was acquitted, it would embolden him to continue his campaign against Brooke. And with his resources and connections, he might eventually succeed in taking Hope away. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Vernon held his breath as the foreman stood to speak. "On the charge of domestic violence, we find the defendant guilty." Vernon felt relief flood through him, but the foreman wasn't finished. "On the charge of aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of endangering the welfare of a child, we find the defendant guilty." Guilty on all counts. Vernon looked across the courtroom and saw Clayton's face go white with shock and rage. For the first time since this began, the mask of civilized control completely slipped away, revealing the dangerous predator underneath. As the judge scheduled sentencing for the following week, Vernon realized that while they'd won this battle, the war was far from over. Men like Clayton didn't accept defeat gracefully, and his family had resources that could keep this fight going for years. But for now, justice had been served. Clayton would face prison time, and Hope would grow up knowing that her mother had been brave enough to fight for the truth. It was a beginning, not an ending, but sometimes a beginning was enough. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, but by Monday morning, Clayton's world had already begun to collapse in ways that went far beyond the criminal conviction. Vernon first learned about it when his phone rang at 6 a.m. It was Gwen, calling from her office where she'd been working through the night. "Have you seen the morning news?" she asked without preamble. "I just got up," Vernon replied, stumbling toward his coffee maker while trying to keep his voice down. Brooke and Hope were still sleeping in the guest room. "Turn on Channel 7. The story broke about 2 hours ago." Vernon grabbed the remote and found the local news channel. A well-groomed reporter was standing outside the gleaming headquarters of Marshall Industries, speaking earnestly into the camera. "ICM. Board of Directors announced late last night that CEO Clayton Marshall has been terminated effective immediately following his conviction on domestic violence charges. The company's stock price has already dropped 12% in pre-market trading as investors react to the scandal." Vernon felt a grim satisfaction as he watched the story unfold. The reporter interviewed several business analysts who explained that Marshall Industries' reputation had been severely damaged by the highly publicized trial. Major clients were reportedly reconsidering their contracts, and the company's board had moved quickly to distance themselves from Clayton. "This is just the beginning," Gwen said over the phone. "I've been getting calls all morning from reporters wanting to interview Brooke. The story is going national." Vernon's satisfaction quickly turned to concern. Media attention could be a double-edged sword. It might help establish the truth about Clayton's abuse, but it could also expose Brooke and Hope to unwanted scrutiny and potential danger. What kind of interview requests? Everything from local news to national magazines, Gwen replied. There's apparently significant interest in the story of a wealthy CEO being held accountable for domestic violence. It's not something that happens very often. Vernon thought about the implications. Clayton had built his identity around being a successful businessman and community leader. Having that image destroyed publicly would be devastating to someone with his psychological profile. Gwen, I'm worried about how Clayton will react to this level of public humiliation. Men like him can become dangerous when they lose everything. I've already thought of that, Gwen said. I'm filing for an extension of the restraining order and requesting additional security measures. Clayton's facing prison time and complete social destruction that makes him unpredictable. After hanging up, Vernon made breakfast and waited for Brooke to wake up. When she emerged from the guest room carrying Hope, she looked more rested than she had in weeks. The trial had been emotionally exhausting, but the guilty verdict seemed to have lifted a weight from her shoulders. Good morning, she said, settling Hope into her high chair. Any news on sentencing? Vernon hesitated, then decided she needed to know about the media coverage. He showed her the news reports, watching her face as she absorbed the magnitude of the story. My God, Brooke said quietly, this is everywhere. The business community is treating it as a major scandal, Vernon explained. Domestic violence by a CEO is apparently rare enough to be newsworthy, especially when it involves attempted murder of a pregnant wife. Brooke was quiet for several minutes, feeding Hope while processing the information. Vernon, I know I should feel vindicated, but I'm actually scared. Clayton's lost everything now, his job, his reputation, his social standing. What if he decides he has nothing left to lose? Vernon had been thinking the same thing. Gwen's working on additional protection, and he's facing sentencing tomorrow. He might be in jail soon. Might be, Brooke repeated. But what if he gets a light sentence? What if his lawyers find a way to keep him out of prison? Before Vernon could answer, his phone rang again. This time it was Detective Thornton. Dr. Hamilton, we have a situation, Thornton said. Clayton Marshall violated his restraining order about an hour ago. He was spotted outside your apartment building by a neighbor who recognized him from the news coverage. Vernon felt ice in his veins. Is he still there? No, he fled when patrol cars arrived. But Dr. Hamilton, he left something behind that I think you should know about. Tonar, what kind of something? Photos of your sister and the baby. Recent photos, taken with a telephoto lens. He's been surveilling your apartment. Vernon's blood pressure spiked. Clayton had been stalking them, watching their movements, gathering information. Any idea how long he's been doing this? Based on the photo timestamps, at least a week, Thornton replied. Dr. Hamilton, I need you to be very careful. Men who engage in surveillance behavior often escalate to more direct action. Clayton's facing prison time and social destruction. He may feel he has nothing left to lose. After Detective Thornton hung up, Vernon immediately called his hospital supervisor to request emergency leave. He wasn't comfortable leaving Brooke and Hope alone, even for his shifts. What's wrong? Brooke asked, seeing his expression. Vernon explained about the surveillance photos, watching as fear crept back into her eyes. The brief sense of safety she'd gained from the guilty verdict was already evaporating. He was watching us, she said quietly, taking pictures of Hope. Vernon, what if he tries to take her? That's not going to happen, Vernon said firmly, though privately he shared her fear. We're going to stay together until this is resolved. No one goes anywhere alone. The phone rang again. This time it was their mother. Vernon, I just saw the news, Maureen said, her voice tight with worry. They're saying Clayton lost his job and that he violated the restraining order. Are you and Brooke safe? We're being careful, Mom, Vernon replied. The police are looking for him. I'm coming over, Maureen announced. Don't argue with me. If Clayton is desperate enough to stalk you, then Brooke and Hope need all the protection they can get. After she hung up, Vernon realized that Clayton's downfall might actually make him more dangerous, not less. A man with everything to lose might show restraint, but a man who'd already lost everything might be capable of anything. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You destroyed my life. You turned my wife against me. You took my daughter away. This isn't over." Vernon immediately forwarded the message to Detective Thornton and showed it to Brooke. Her face went pale as she read the words. "He still thinks of Hope as his daughter," she said. "Vernon, what if he tries to kidnap her?" "We're not going to let that happen," Vernon said, though the text message had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Clayton was clearly unstable and focused on revenge. Over the next few hours, more details emerged about Clayton's rapid downfall. The news reported that several of his business partners were now distancing themselves from him, claiming they'd had no knowledge of his violent behavior. His country club had suspended his membership, and his charitable board positions had been quietly terminated. Most damaging of all, former employees were beginning to come forward with stories about Clayton's temper and controlling behavior in the workplace. A pattern was emerging of a man who'd built his success through intimidation and manipulation, not just leadership skill. "It's like watching a house of cards collapse," Gwen said when she arrived that afternoon with additional legal documents. Everything Clayton built was based on maintaining a false image. Once that image cracked, the whole structure fell apart. "Any word on sentencing?" Vernon asked. "The prosecution is pushing for the maximum 10 years, Gwen replied. "With the media attention and the restraining order violation, the judge is likely to be harsh, but Clayton's lawyers are still fighting for probation and community service." Vernon couldn't imagine Clayton avoiding prison time, but wealthy defendants had advantages that others didn't. Money could buy skilled lawyers, character witnesses, and rehabilitation programs that might influence sentencing. That evening, as they ate dinner together, Vernon watched Brooke playing with Hope and felt a fierce protectiveness wash over him. These two innocent people had been targeted by a predator who'd systematically destroyed their sense of safety and security. Clayton had already stolen years of Brooke's life through control and abuse. Vernon wasn't going to let him steal any more. But as night fell and Vernon checked the locks on his apartment doors for the third time, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Clayton was desperate, humiliated, and facing prison time. In Vernon's experience, that combination made people capable of extreme actions. Tomorrow's sentencing would determine Clayton's immediate future, but Vernon suspected that the real battle for Brooke and Hope's safety was just beginning. Outside his apartment window, the city lights twinkled peacefully, giving no hint of the danger that might be lurking in the shadows. Vernon made a mental note to stay vigilant. Their lives might depend on it. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, matching Vernon's mood as he prepared for Clayton's sentencing hearing. The past 24 hours had been tense. Police patrols had increased around his apartment building, but there had been no sign of Clayton since the restraining order violation. "I keep thinking he's going to appear out of nowhere," Brooke said as she fed Hope breakfast. She'd barely slept, jumping at every sound in the hallway. "The courthouse will have extra security today," Vernon assured her. "Detective Thornton promised that Clayton won't be able to get near you." Gwen arrived early to escort them to the courthouse. She'd arranged for them to enter through a private entrance to avoid the media circus that had gathered on the front steps. "The press coverage has been intense," Gwen reported as they drove downtown. 3 national news magazines want to interview Brooke, and there's a documentary filmmaker interested in telling the story. "I'm not ready for that," Brooke said immediately. "Maybe someday, but right now I just want Hope to be safe." Vernon agreed. Media attention might help other abuse victims by raising awareness, but Brooke's priority had to be protecting herself and her daughter. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. Vernon recognized several faces from Clayton's former social circle, though their expressions ranged from supportive to openly curious. The guilty verdict had divided Clayton's friends. Some blamed Brooke for destroying a good man, while others admitted they'd suspected something was wrong for years. Clayton entered with his legal team, flanked by court officers. He looked thinner than Vernon remembered, his expensive suit somehow making him appear smaller rather than more impressive. Prison orange would be a dramatic change from his usual wardrobe. Judge Fairfield called the hearing to order and asked both sides to present their sentencing arguments. The prosecution went first, with D.A. Kim laying out the severity of Clayton's crimes and the need for accountability. "Your Honor," De Kim said, "this case represents domestic violence at its most dangerous. Mr. Marshall's actions didn't just injure his wife, they required emergency surgery that could have failed, leaving a newborn without her mother. The defendant has shown no remorse for his actions and has continued to harass and stalk his victims, even after conviction. She presented evidence of the restraining order violation, the surveillance photos, and the threatening text message Vernon had received. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of a man who refused to accept responsibility for his actions. When Morrison rose for the defense, Vernon braced himself for another attempt to minimize Clayton's crimes, but the lawyer's usual confidence seemed to diminish the media coverage, and his client's continued bad behavior had clearly weakened his position. "Your Honor," Morrison began, "Mr. Marshall is a first-time offender who built a successful business and contributed significantly to the community. The stress of business pressures and impending fatherhood led to a moment of poor judgment that he deeply regrets." Vernon noticed that Morrison didn't claim Clayton was innocent, just that his crimes were aberrations rather than patterns. It was a subtle but significant shift in strategy. "Mr. Marshall has lost his career, his reputation, and his standing in the community," Morrison continued. "He's prepared to undergo counseling and anger management as part of his rehabilitation. Incarceration would serve no purpose other than revenge." Judge Fairfield listened to both arguments without expression, then asked if Clayton wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Vernon watched as his brother-in-law stood, wondering if he would finally show genuine remorse. "Your Honor," Clayton said, his voice carefully controlled, "I take full responsibility for my actions on the night in question. The stress I was under doesn't excuse what happened, and I deeply regret that my wife and daughter were hurt because of my poor judgment." Vernon noticed the careful phrasing Clayton admitted to poor judgment rather than deliberate violence, and he referred to Brooke and Hope as my wife and daughter, maintaining his claim to ownership even in his apology. "I've lost everything I worked for because of that night," Clayton continued. "My career, my reputation, my family. I understand that there must be consequences for my actions, and I'm prepared to accept whatever sentence you deem appropriate." When Clayton sat down, Judge Fairfield reviewed her notes for several minutes. The courtroom was completely silent, everyone waiting to hear how justice would be served. "Mr. Marshall," Judge Fairfield finally said, "I've presided over many domestic violence cases in my career, and I've learned to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and calculated manipulation. Your statement today focused primarily on your losses rather than your victim's suffering." Vernon felt a surge of hope. Judge Fairfield had seen through Clayton's performance. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "your behavior since conviction violating the restraining order, stalking your victims, sending threatening messages demonstrates that you view yourself as the wrong party rather than the perpetrator of serious crimes." Clayton's face remained impassive, but Vernon could see tension in his shoulders. Domestic violence during pregnancy represents one of the most serious forms of assault because it endangers two lives. Judge Fairfield said, "Your actions required emergency surgery and could have resulted in the deaths of both your wife and unborn child. That you continue to minimize these actions tells me that you remain a danger to your victims." Vernon held his breath as the judge prepared to announce the sentence. "Mr. Marshall, I sentence you to 8 years in state prison on the domestic violence and assault charges, and 2 additional years for endangering the welfare of a child. These sentences will run consecutively, for a total of 10 years incarceration." 10 years. Vernon felt relief flooding through him as he heard Brooke's quiet gasp behind him. Clayton would be in prison for a decade, long enough for Hope to grow up and for Brooke to rebuild her life completely. Judge Fairfield wasn't finished. "Additionally, I'm issuing a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact between Mr. Marshall and his victims. This order will remain in effect for 5 years after his release from prison." As the judge pronounced the sentence, Vernon watched Clayton's carefully maintained composure finally crack, his face flushed with rage, and he turned to stare at Brooke with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," Clayton said loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "You destroyed my life, but I'll find a way to destroy yours." Court officers immediately moved to restrain him as Judge Fairfield called for order. "Mr. Marshall, you've just threatened your victims in open court. I'm adding an additional charge of criminal intimidation to your record." As Clayton was led away in handcuffs, still shouting threats, Vernon felt both relief and continued concern. 10 years was a long sentence, but Clayton's final outburst proved that prison wouldn't cure his fundamental inability to accept responsibility. Outside the courthouse, Gwen gathered Vernon and Brooke away from the waiting reporters. "This is as good an outcome as we could have hoped for," she said. 10 years gives you time to establish complete independence and security." "What about his threats?" Brooke asked. "Even from prison, couldn't he find ways to hurt us?" "Prison communication is monitored," Gwen explained, "and the permanent restraining order means any attempt to contact you will result in additional charges. Plus, his financial resources are about to be significantly reduced." Vernon raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? I filed for emergency asset recovery this morning," Gwen said with satisfaction. "Now that Clayton's been sentenced, we can move aggressively to reclaim the money he stole from Brooke. The offshore accounts, the fraudulent business investments, the property he purchased with marital funds, all of it can be recovered." For the first time since this nightmare began, Vernon saw genuine hope in his sister's eyes. "You mean I might actually have some financial independence?" "More than that," Gwen said. "Based on my analysis of your marital assets, you should recover enough money to buy a house, restart your career if you want to, and provide for Hope's future. Clayton's attempt to leave you with nothing is going to backfire spectacularly." As they drove home, Vernon reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. Clayton was going to prison. Brooke was regaining her independence, and Hope would grow up safe from her father's violence. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been comprehensive. That evening, as Vernon watched Brooke play with Hope in his living room, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The legal system had worked as it was supposed to, holding a wealthy abuser accountable despite his advantages of money and status. "Vernon," Brooke said quietly, "I want you to know how grateful I am. If you hadn't answered your phone that night, if you hadn't been willing to stand up to Clayton—" "You don't need to thank me," Vernon interrupted. "You're my sister. Protecting you and Hope isn't heroic, it's just what family does." "But not every family would have done what you did," Brooke said. "Some people would have encouraged me to work things out privately, to avoid scandal, to think about Clayton's career and reputation." Vernon thought about Clayton's parents, who had indeed pressured Brooke to minimize the abuse to protect their son's image. Those people enable abusers by prioritizing appearances over safety. "I'm going to make sure Hope understands that love doesn't hurt," Brooke said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "And that speaking the truth is always the right choice, even when it's difficult." As Vernon watched his niece sleep peacefully in her mother's arms, he felt hope for their future. Clayton's reign of terror was over, and Brooke was finally free to become the person she was meant to be. The scars would take time to heal, but the worst was behind them. Justice had been served, and a new chapter was beginning. 6 months later, Vernon stood in the kitchen of Brooke's new house, watching his sister prepare breakfast for Hope, who was now chattering happily in her high chair. The small but comfortable home was in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from downtown, with a fenced yard where Hope could play safely as she grew. "She's getting so big," Vernon said, marveling at how much his niece had changed. At 10 months old, Hope was pulling herself up to standing and showing the determined personality she'd inherited from her mother. "The pediatrician says she's advanced for her age," Brooke replied, cutting up small pieces of fruit for Hope's breakfast. "All that early stimulation in the NICU apparently helped her development," Vernon smiled, remembering those terrifying first weeks when Hope's survival had been uncertain. Now she was a healthy, curious baby who brought joy to everyone around her. The house around them reflected Brooke's growing confidence and independence. She'd chosen every piece of furniture herself, decorated the walls with photos of Hope and their family, and created a space that felt completely different from the sterile perfection of Clayton's penthouse. "Any regrets about not taking the bigger house?" Vernon asked. Gwen had recovered nearly $2 million in marital assets, enough for Brooke to buy a much larger home if she'd wanted. "None at all," Brooke said firmly. "This place is ours. Hope and I picked it out together, and we can afford the payments easily with what's left over after we set up her college fund. It's exactly what we need." Vernon was proud of how carefully Brooke had managed her recovered assets. She'd invested most of the money conservatively, ensuring long-term security for herself and Hope. The days of depending on anyone else for financial support were over. "Speaking of which," Brooke said, "I have some news. I had lunch with Sarah Chen yesterday, from the marketing firm downtown. The one who offered you a consulting position. That's the one. They want me to come on board as a full partner, specializing in crisis communications for businesses dealing with reputation management. Vernon raised an eyebrow. That's quite a career shift from your old marketing focus. Brooke laughed. Apparently, we're surviving a high-profile domestic violence case, and Media Circus makes me uniquely qualified to help other people navigate public relations disasters. Who knew my nightmare would become a professional asset? Are you going to take it? I think so, Brooke said, lifting Hope from her high chair. The hours are flexible, I can work mostly from home, and the money is excellent. Plus, it feels like I'd be using what happened to us for something positive. Vernon felt a surge of pride. 6 months ago, Brooke had been financially dependent and emotionally devastated. Now she was considering a prestigious business partnership that would utilize her intelligence and experience. What about daycare for Hope while you're working? Mom has volunteered to help, Brooke said. She's been amazing these past few months. I think she feels like she needs to make up for not seeing the abuse earlier. Shamam. Maureen had indeed been a constant source of support, visiting several times a week and providing the kind of practical help that new mothers desperately need. Vernon was grateful that their family had grown closer, rather than being torn apart by the crisis. Any word from Clayton? Vernon asked, though he already knew the answer. Prison mail was monitored, and Clayton hadn't attempted any contact since his final threats in the courtroom. Nothing direct, Brooks said, but Gwen heard through legal channels that he's not adjusting well to prison life. Apparently, wealthy businessmen don't have much status among other inmates. Vernon felt no sympathy for Clayton's difficulties. The man had built his life on controlling and intimidating others. Discovering that prison inmates weren't impressed by his former success was probably a harsh but necessary education. The important thing is that you and Hope are safe, Vernon said. Everything else is just karma. His phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Thornton. Wanted you to know Clayton Marshall was denied parole consideration. Earliest possible release is still 7 years away. Vernon showed the message to Brooke, who nodded with satisfaction. Good. 7 years is enough time for Hope to grow up not remembering him at all. They were interrupted by a knock at the front door. Vernon answered it to find a woman in her 30s with a professional but nervous demeanor. Ms. Hamilton, the woman said. I'm Jessica Torres from Channel 7 News. I was wondering if you might be willing to do an interview about your experience with domestic violence during pregnancy. Vernon started to close the door, but Brooke appeared beside him. What kind of interview? She asked. We're doing a series on domestic violence awareness, Jessica explained. Your case has become a symbol of how the justice system can work when victims find the courage to speak up. We'd like to highlight how you've rebuilt your life. Brooke considered the request for a moment. Let me think about it, she said. Can you call me next week? After Jessica left, Vernon asked, Are you seriously considering doing media interviews? Maybe, Brooke said. I've been getting calls from domestic violence support groups asking me to speak to other survivors. If telling my story helps even one woman recognize that she's being abused, it might be worth it. Vernon understood her reasoning, but he worried about the public attention. Just promise me you'll be careful about security. Even with Clayton in prison, his family is still out there. Margaret and Charles Marshall have been completely silent since the sentencing, Brooke said. I think they're too embarrassed by their son's crimes to cause any trouble. Vernon hoped she was right, but he'd learned not to underestimate the lengths that wealthy, powerful people would go to protect their interests. That afternoon, Vernon returned to his own apartment for the first time in weeks. He'd been staying in Brooke's guest room most nights, reluctant to leave her and Hope alone, despite the round-the-clock security system she'd installed. His apartment felt strangely empty after months of baby sounds and family chaos. Vernon realized how much he'd enjoyed having Brooke and Hope in his life every day, and how quiet his world had become without them. His phone rang. It was Nurse Colleen from the hospital. Vernon, I know you're on leave, but we have a situation that could really use your expertise. What kind of situation? 25-year-old woman, 34 weeks pregnant, came in with injuries she claims are from a fall, Colleen explained. But the injury patterns look familiar, and she seems terrified when her boyfriend visits. Vernon felt his protective instincts activate. What do the attending physicians think? They're not sure. The injuries could be consistent with a fall, but her behavior suggests there's more to the story. She keeps asking if her medical records are confidential and whether anyone can access them without her permission. Vernon recognized the signs a pregnant woman testing whether she could trust medical staff with the truth about abuse. It was exactly the kind of case where his experience with Brooke's situation could make a difference. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said. As Vernon drove to the hospital, he reflected on how his experience with Clayton's abuse had changed his perspective on his work. He'd always been a skilled trauma surgeon, but now he understood the human dynamics behind the injuries in ways he never had before. At the hospital, Vernon found the patient, Maria Santos, sitting alone in her room while her boyfriend spoke with nurses at the station. She was young and pretty, with the kind of quiet fear in her eyes that Vernon now recognized immediately. "Ms. Santos, I'm Dr. Hamilton," he said gently. "I specialize in trauma cases, and I'd like to examine your injuries if that's okay with you." Maria nodded nervously. "The other doctors say everything looks fine, but I'm still worried about the baby." Vernon conducted a thorough examination, noting injury patterns that were inconsistent with a simple fall. "Ms. Santos, can you tell me exactly how you were injured?" Maria repeated the story about falling downstairs, but her voice lacked conviction. Vernon had heard enough coach stories to recognize one. "Ms. Santos," he said quietly, "I want you to know that anything you tell me is confidential. Medical records can't be shared without your permission, and there are protections for patients who are victims of domestic violence." Maria's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly. "Why are you asking me this?" Vernon made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "Because my sister was 8 months pregnant when her husband attacked her. She nearly died, and so did her baby. If someone had asked her the right questions earlier, maybe we could have prevented that attack." Maria stared at him for a long moment, then began to cry. "He said if I ever told anyone, he'd make sure I never saw the baby again. He has a good job and family connections who would believe me over him." "I would," Vernon said simply. "And so would the police, the courts, and the domestic violence advocates who specialize in helping women like you." Over the next hour, Vernon helped Maria contact the same resources that had saved Brooke's life: Detective Thornton, Gwen Pierce's law firm, and the hospital's domestic violence coordinator. By the time her boyfriend realized something was wrong, Maria was under police protection and legal safeguards. Driving home that evening, Vernon realized that his experience with Brooke's case had given him a new mission. He couldn't save every victim of domestic violence, but he could use his medical expertise and personal knowledge to help identify and protect others. When he arrived at Brooke's house, he found her in the living room with Hope, reading together before bedtime. The peaceful domestic scene was a stark contrast to the hospital crisis he'd just left. "How was your day?" Brooke asked, making room for him on the couch. Vernon told her about Maria Santos and how his experience with Clayton's case had helped him recognize the signs of abuse. Brooke listened thoughtfully, occasionally looking down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Vernon," she said when he finished, "I've been thinking about what that reporter said about our case becoming a symbol of how the justice system can work. Maybe we have a responsibility to help other women who are going through what I went through." "What did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet," Brooke admitted. "But I keep thinking about all the advantages. I had a brother who's a doctor, financial resources to hire good lawyers, a family support system. Most women don't have those advantages." Vernon understood what she was suggesting. Their experience with Clayton hadn't just been a personal victory, it was proof that domestic violence could be successfully prosecuted even when the abuser had significant social and economic power. "We could start a foundation," Vernon suggested. "Provide legal and medical support for domestic violence victims who don't have resources. Or create a training program for medical professionals," Brooke added. "Teach them how to recognize abuse patterns and connect victims with help." As they discussed possibilities, Vernon felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his work as a trauma surgeon. Clayton's abuse had been evil, but perhaps some good could come from it if they used their experience to help others. "Whatever we do," Brooke said, "I want Hope to understand that speaking the truth matters. Even when it's difficult, I want her to grow up knowing that her mother fought for justice and won." Vernon looked at his sleeping niece and felt a deep sense of hope for her future. Hope would grow up safe, loved, and surrounded by adults who understood that protecting children sometimes meant standing up to dangerous people. The scars from Clayton's abuse would always be there, but they no longer defined Brooke's life. She had reclaimed her independence, rebuilt her confidence, and created a secure future for herself and her daughter. Most importantly, she had learned that love doesn't hurt, and that protecting someone from consequences isn't really protecting them at all. It was a lesson that would guide her as a mother and as a survivor who had found the courage to speak her truth. Outside, the sun was setting over their quiet neighborhood, painting the sky in soft pastels that promised a peaceful night. Inside, a family that had survived the worst was building something beautiful from the pieces. Clayton was in prison where he belonged. Justice had been served, and new beginnings were possible. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was everything. Epilogue. 1 year later, Vernon stood at the podium of the medical conference center, looking out at an audience of trauma surgeons, emergency physicians, and domestic violence advocates. The Hamilton Foundation's first annual training conference had drawn over 300 medical professionals who wanted to learn how to better identify and assist victims of domestic violence. "The truth is," Vernon said, concluding his presentation, "most of us in medicine receive very little training in recognizing abuse patterns. We're taught to treat injuries, not to understand the human dynamics that cause them. But when a pregnant woman arrives with injuries that could be accidental, we have an obligation to ask the right questions." In the audience, he could see Brooke holding Hope, now an active 18-month-old who charmed everyone she met. Brooke had become a powerful advocate for domestic violence victims, combining her business expertise with her personal experience to create support systems that actually worked. After the presentation, Vernon joined Brooke and Hope in the conference center cafe. Hope immediately reached for him, babbling what sounded like Uncle Vernon, though her pronunciation was still developing. "How do you think it went?" Vernon asked, settling Hope on his lap. "Better than we hoped," Brooke replied. "Dr. Chen told me that 5 hospitals have already committed to implementing our screening protocols, and the legal advocacy program has funding requests from 3 states. The Hamilton Foundation had grown beyond their initial vision, providing training, resources, and direct support to domestic violence victims across the region. What had started as a way to find meaning in their trauma had become a legitimate force for change. "Any word from the documentary producers?" Vernon asked. "They want to film our next board meeting," Brooke said. "The story of how we turned our worst experience into something positive apparently has national appeal." Vernon wasn't entirely comfortable with the media attention, but he understood its value. Every woman who saw their story and recognized her own situation was potentially a life saved. "Mama, up," Hope demanded, reaching for Brooke. At 18 months, she was already showing signs of the strong will that had helped her survive her difficult birth. As Vernon watched Brooke lift her daughter, he reflected on how much their lives had changed. Clayton was serving his sentence in a maximum security prison, his appeals having been denied at every level. His parents had moved to another state, apparently unable to face the social embarrassment of their son's crimes. Most importantly, Hope was growing up happy, healthy, and completely unaware that she'd once been in danger. She would never remember the fear or violence, only the love and security that surrounded her now. "Vernon," Brooke said quietly, "I want you to know that I finally understand what you meant that night when you said that love sometimes means standing up to someone, not just standing up for them." "What made you think of that, watching Hope?" Brooke replied. "I want her to grow up knowing that real love means protecting people from harm, even when it's difficult, even when it means confronting people we care about." Vernon nodded, understanding the deeper truth she was expressing. Their family had been tested by Clayton's abuse, but they'd emerged stronger because they'd chosen truth over convenience, safety over social harmony. As they gathered their things to leave, Vernon felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they'd traveled together. It had been painful, terrifying, and exhausting, but it had also proven that justice was possible, that families could heal, and that speaking the truth really did matter. Hope would grow up in a world where her mother was respected for her courage, where her uncle was known for his commitment to protecting the vulnerable, and where love meant safety rather than fear. It wasn't the ending any of them would have chosen, but it was perhaps the ending they all needed. Sometimes the price of silence was too high to pay, And sometimes finding your voice was the greatest gift you could give to the people you loved. As they walked toward their car, Hope babbling happily in her mother's arms, Vernon realized that they had indeed found their new beginning. And this time, they would never let anyone take it away.